So, 9 reasons why George Washington was a piece of shit. The first one is he owned slaves. He owned 318 slaves. He got, when he was 11 years old, he got 10 slaves after his father had died. Yeah, it's sad his poor dad died, but now he has 11 people to do all of his work and all of his bidding for him. And his father had slaves. He got inherited 10 slaves when he was 11 years old, and then he dies with 318 slaves. There was not a single moment in time when George Washington was without a slave, without a servant, without a person who was owned by him that he commanded and controlled and oppressed. And that affects everything. It absolutely affects everything. The Constitution has a 3/5 clause. You have there's a whole bunch of stuff. There's the 3/5 clause, the fugitive slave clause. There was the just everything. Okay, there's like 3 or 4 or 5 examples, but it affected the Constitution. It affected the national policy when he became the president. In fact, when the War for Independence, he jumped into the foray to fight the Revolutionary War in order to protect his slaves. Lord Dunmore issued the Emancipation Proclamation first, a British person, and that pissed off George Washington. So he's like, the Boston Tea Party, he didn't care about the Boston Tea Party. No, that's destruction of property. How dare those rabble-rousers destroy property? But then they had the Coercive Acts, and so the British government came down hard on the entire state of Massachusetts for the actions of a few. And then that sort of galvanized the people in Massachusetts to have a revolution in 1774, but still George Washington wasn't on board. It wasn't until he issued the Lord Dunmore, the Royal Governor of Virginia, issued the Emancipation Proclamation. And a lot of it had to do with the storage of gunpowder and some other things. And then eventually the Patriots pushed Lord Dunmore out on a boat, and then he was gone. So the American Revolutionary War, because he owned slaves, that was the reason why he went in there. He has the wooden teeth. The wooden teeth aren't wooden at all. He actually took it from slaves. The wooden teeth, and this is, even though you have that one lady, what's her name? I don't know. I'm glad I forgot her because she is an asshole. But she was like, where'd you get this information at? Where's your source at? Sorry, I told you something you didn't know, and now all of a sudden, you're going to come after me like, how dare you say something? It's like people want you to be irrelevant. I mean, history means something, and automatically, Howard Zinn says history is from the bottom up, and so my family's history is where history begins. Because that's us regular people. It's not the elites and the big decisions that they're making, but it's how it affects us, the little people, as Nigel Farage, so eloquently puts it. And 318 slaves. You had a ton of slaves. So just go down the names and the list and the interactions and what they're doing. We don't even know, we got the list of all their names. So we do know their names. But we don't know, we know their ages, we know their names, but we don't know their character, what they were, what they're about, maybe their job, what their job was for George. But there's a ton of people. There's so many people. And, okay, so that's, I think it's important to know that it was a shit ton of 318 people. People wanted to defend George Washington. Why? Because he created a mule? Because he fought the War of Independence? Like that wasn't inevitable? Like that wasn't going to happen anyways? And he was cruel to Charlotte. There was a overseer that beat the holy shit out of her, and he was like, that's absolutely right. You should have done that. And then later on, it turned out that he was a scallywag, a crappy human being. And so even though he was a scallywag, even though he was a crappy human being, I don't know if he ever apologized or did what, so what I mean. And then Oni Judge, Hercules Harry, they run away. And so it's all about slavery. That's a huge thing. That's a huge thing, okay? That's the number one reason why he was a piece of shit. William Lloyd Garrison says that's all that he needs. That's the only thing he needs to know about George Washington. He owned slaves. He thought he owned the bodies of other people, and they did free labor. Now, a lot of people talk about his will. They talk about his ability, or his, he freed the slaves, or so-called. But I don't think they would have actually been freed. It was when Martha Washington started getting scared for her own life. That's when they got freed. But they weren't free until, she feared for her life. Then like, okay, yeah, the will says that they should be freed. I'm going to go ahead and free them. Yeah, hurry up and free them, And, but that goes to show you, even though it was lawful and the right thing to do, they still would have fought it, but because they feared for their lives, that was the reason. But she only freed his slaves, kept her own slaves. She had the ability to free, they were dower slaves, so it was to her estate. She had one slave personally to herself, and she didn't even free that one person. So Martha Washington is worse in terms of slavery than George, and also how convenient for George to free the slaves once he was dead. Oh, he's dead, now they're free. Okay, so the evidence that I have of the wooden teeth is this. George Washington, he had the Cadillac of dentures. So he was wealthy, he had all this land, 60,000 acres, 5 plantations in Mount Vernon, 50,000 acres in West Virginia, and, I don't know, New York, Pennsylvania, and, so he deserved the best of the best, just like Sneakers O'Toole. I am Sneakers O'Toole. You can't tell me to take my sneakers off. I am Sneakers O'Toole. He had the Cadillac of dentures back in that day. He had one good tooth in his mouth that kept the rest of his dentures held together. George Washington's dentures were made up of ivory, tusk, and slave's teeth. Deep within one of Washington's account books is an entry which details Washington's purchase of 9 teeth from Negroes for 122 shillings. In May of 1784, George Washington paid several unnamed Negroes, presumably Mount Vernon slaves, 122 shillings for 9 teeth. So he bought 9 teeth, and he bought it for slightly less than 1/3 of the going rate that was advertised in the papers. And this is, quote verbatim on the account of the French dentist sick. So dentist, they didn't put the T, Dr. Lee May, but they said it's the French dentist, and Lee May, Lee Moyer, he wrote choose. C-H-U-S-E. Read the U.S. Constitution, and the way they spell choose is C-H-U-S-E. And so they spelled words differently. He's French, so he was most likely Lee Moyer. I don't know how important that is, but they bought it from a French dentist, 9 teeth, probably from Mount Vernon slaves, and I don't know if these slaves' teeth are just falling out or if they pulled them. And almost certainly Lee Moyer, George Washington, the face of the International Reserve Currency greenback, had slave teeth in his mouth, teeth that had been yanked from the heads of his slaves and fitted into his 1784 dentures. So the wooden teeth myth covers up the fact that he had dentures from the teeth of slaves, So, he didn't have a powdered wig, but he would powder his hair. He had the slaves do that. He had the slaves do all this shit. So, how could you not succeed when you have, so many people working for you for free? And he complained, I just can't get quit of the Negro. So he did have an addiction to oppression and power. I get the power, you get none. And that's, an oppressor kills the humanity of those that they oppress. Native American genocide, such as the Scorched Earth Sullivan campaign. He genocides the Iroquois in northern New York, in the upstate New York. He killed all the Iroquois children, women, the camps, scorched earth. So absolute warfare. And then Mad Anthony's Northwest Indian War, when he became president, he kills the Miami and the Shawnee and the Mingo in Ohio and these western lands and pushes them further north. So he genocides the Iroquois, fighting against the Native Americans in Ohio. So he's genociding people. He's got a shit ton of slaves. Francis Scott Key, who wrote the Star-Spangled Banner, people's like, he's a slave owner. He owned 1 slave at one point, and then 6 slaves or 7 slaves at the most at another point. So when it comes to being a slave owner, Francis Scott Key can't hold a candle to George Washington. This is a major slave owner. There's a slave, number 3, there's a slave puppy genocide. George Washington ordered all dogs of his slaves, but the overseers slaughtered. So a couple of the overseers got to keep their dogs, but every other dog on the plantation was killed. And even Thomas Jefferson did this too. And some reason I think that there's some people, oh, Native American genocide, blah, 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 slavery, blah, 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 who cares? Wait, he killed puppies? Aww, why'd he kill them puppies? You don't give a shit that he killed humans? Murder is the worst thing you can do to people. People's priorities are so messed up. And then I'll mention this too. Some people say, oh, you can't judge. You can't judge people back in the past by our standards today. Well, there's 2 points I want to make to that. There's wage slaves, okay? So wage slavery, which if you valued yourself, you're renting your body out for somebody else. And before, when there was a labor movement and people actually respected themselves and their own dignity, you know, they wouldn't do that so easily, so quickly. And then when they did that, they would, you know, band together and unionize so that they, you know, wouldn't be so disrespected. But you can make stuff, you can be a baker, make a cake, and then that's not, you know, you're making something and you're offering a product out to them and then they're buying it. So you're a merchant, you're a, you know, you're making something, you're doing something else. That's an independent work. That's something you can take pride in. Nobody's lording over you, just the, you know, the market. And so there's wage slavery today. Perhaps we would be talking about that. But then the other thing is his contemporaries. You had the Marquis de Lafayette. You had John Adams, the second president of the United States. You had, I want to say, John Laurens. I'm going to say Henry Laurens was the big slave owner, but his son John Laurens was totally against it. John Laurens and George Washington were buddies, and he mentioned it. He tried to get a battalion of slaves, but eventually they cracked down on it and went the opposite. Instead of putting guns in the slaves' hands to fight the American Revolution, which he fought for the sake of slavery. So big shocker, right? They're not going to put guns in the hands of slaves, even though they're slaves, right? They got to do what they're told, but they're like, oh my God, they might turn them guns around. And so the God, I totally lost my train of thought there. So, the slavery, you can't judge the time by the... Okay, but we could judge their time by their own time, right? I think I could judge them by my time. But let's judge them by their own time. If we're going to sit there and say that George Washington is acceptable because he owned slaves, you are Alexander Hamilton. He didn't own slaves. He was opposed to it. John Adams, he was opposed to it. The Marquis de Lafayette, who was the French man who came over and helped fight the American Revolution, he was opposed to it. In fact, he even tried to convince George Washington to buy a plot of ground so that way he could pay his laborers, be a decent human being, and then still run a profitable business. But George Washington was like, I'm not going to pay them. I would rather own them. And so that's 4 contemporaries. So if you're going to excuse a piece of shit like George Washington for his slavery, then you are minimizing the good people that was fighting a hard fight. If it's such a different era, could you imagine speaking up against the slave society, being a John Laurens or an Alexander Hamilton or a Marquis de Lafayette or John Adams? Or the state of Pennsylvania. They wiped out slavery, the Abolition of Slavery Act in 1780, I think, 1780. So the entire state of Pennsylvania, there's a lot of, you know, it was mostly a slave society, or most people seem to accept that the 1% could own slaves, but there were people that weren't. And so if we're going to just go ahead and justify him like Julie Chancellor, you know, out of the Southern High School in Louisville, she says, oh, that's a different time, who gives a crap? Oh my God, you're justifying slavery, which is a sick, barbaric practice, but that's obedience. Public schools teaches obedience, and war, genocide, slavery, the worst things in human history comes out of strict obedience to authority. Of course she would say that it's okay that he had slaves because she's got slaves. One man can have 318 slaves and one teacher can have 30 intellectual slaves. Shut up, sit down, I'm the master. So, when you forgive people for doing atrocious things throughout history, you are forgetting the good people who stood up against the society that was largely, I don't even want to say largely, but let's say largely. If it's largely, then that makes Marquis de Lafayette and Alexander Hamilton, which pisses me off, you know, he pisses me off for some of the things he wanted to, you know, get America indebted and to control, to have, you know, be able to have power over people. He wanted to do that. He believed in a monarchy. There's some things that really piss me off about Alexander Hamilton. And John Adams, Alien and Sedition Acts, and, you know, him talking about his excellency and, you know, that big-ass conversation that he had there. And And so, yeah, so by saying that it's okay that he owned slaves because he was just a product of his own time, yeah, there's some truth to that, but then how much more revolutionary would you be if you lived in that time era, and you stood up? Like John Adams, Marquis de Lafayette, John Lawrence, and Alexander Hamilton. So there were people in Pennsylvania. So there were people during his era, during his time frame, that was fighting against it, and they're heroes. They're more heroic even today, because there's people that want to defend the oppressors, violent oppressors, such as George Washington. How did it affect policy? Number 4. These are 9 reasons. And I mean, slavery just encompasses a bunch. But I'm going to go to the next step, okay? So George Washington passed the 1793 Fugitive Slave Act, and that's the foundation for the police and a totalitarian system. So when Harry runs away, when Hercules runs away, then he gets the constables and the police to go chase them, run them back, so that way they can get beat up and, you know, get whipped until they snap and pull Nat Turner. Now, that's 1793 Fugitive Slave Act. That says that even if you were in a slave state and they ran to a free state, you still had to honor that and bring them back. So there was a fugitive slave clause, but the Fugitive Slave Act went ahead and, you know, printed that into hard concrete stone. And by putting it into hard concrete stone, it became the law of the land, and became the law of the land up until Abraham Lincoln. For the next 70 years, you had the Fugitive Slave Act being the law of the land. Cops picking on black men who ran off the plantation to put them back on the plantation to get whipped and beat so they can go out in the fields and pick a bunch of cotton for nothing. For nothing. Living in huts, sleeping on the floors, working from sun up to sundown, never having a day off. So that's the 1793 Fugitive Slave Act. Margaret Garner would slice her child's throat, I want to say 1856, in Cincinnati, northern Kentucky. She runs away. The constables catch her in a free state, and her not wanting her children to go back into slavery, she sliced her own daughter's throat to prevent her from having to endure slavery. So all slave runaways from 1793 until the Civil War were affected because of this policy that George Washington signed. And this is the first thing that he did. You know, he was president in 1789, and then he got reelected president. So this was his top priority in his second term. And I think this is about the same time that Oney Judge ran away. So he had to run away. Oney Judge runs away. And when she runs away, he chases her, and she's just a simpleton. She doesn't know what she's doing. But the one thing that I want to mention about Oney Judge that I think is fantastic, that is something to remember, they told the newspapers that she was spoiled. She was treated more like one of their own children and not like a slave. She was a house slave who's treated wonderfully. Still a slave, but, you know, she's spoiled. Spoiled. And Henry Clay, he said the same thing. Later on, he had somebody that ran away, and he made a big deal about catching her and bringing her back. And it was because on account of being spoiled. Yeah, perhaps oppression robs you of humanity, and you don't have any humanity, and it's important for you to be completely free. Without freedom, you can't authentically do anything. You're not authentically yourself. You can't authentically love, hate, cry, be angry. You're not yourself. You're a tool for somebody else. And the one thing that I remember about her is that when they said, "Why did you leave?" she misspelled it, but she said she wanted complete, or no, the transcriber misspelled it, but they said that she wanted complete freedom. C-O-M-P-L-E-A-T. Complete freedom. That's what she wanted. That's why she ran away. She wanted complete freedom. She was totally aware of her situation, totally aware of what she was doing, totally aware of what she wanted. But because of the 1793 Fugitive Slave Act, she was an outlaw for the rest of her life. She eventually did get married, had children, but she would actually outlive all of them, so I'm not for sure what happened to them. So I'm sure it was tough having the President of the United States chasing you all the way up until he died, which was 1799, so for the next 6 or 7 years. So she was, an outlaw. She had to live as an outlaw because George Washington was a piece of shit. Number 5, George Washington stole French and Indian War veterans' lands and pensions. So he starts the French and Indian War, and I probably should actually mention that. That could be my number 10. He assassinates Jumonville, starts the French and Indian War. People say, well, kick the French out and then give it to the English. I don't know. I mean, as an Englishman, I guess it's good that I'm here and I like my existence, but that's bullshit. He just assassinates, a cauldron, a squad of French, people out in the woods in the campfire. He just ambushed them, murdered them. And then that starts the French and Indian War, which lasts from 1754 to 1763 for 9 years. The French and Indian War was fought because George Washington assassinated this guy, and now England and France is back into having to, fight and kill each other. Now, after the war is over, he gets a big chunk of land, I think by the Kanawha River, because that's how they paid them, by land. And there was other veterans who was supposed to get some land and some money, but he was like, I'm going to get this stuff. I'm going to get these pensions. I'm going to get this land. And he fucks over the veterans that fought in the French and Indian War to enrich himself. So he didn't support the troops. He was the commander of the troops. He was the boss. Everybody else is slaves. He's an oppressor. Everybody is beneath him. And number 6, George Washington sides with England over revolutionary France with the Jay Treaty. So this is another policy thing that he did when he was a president. And the Jay Treaty, you have revolutionary France. The American Revolution happened 1776 to 1783. Treaty of Paris is signed. 1789 is when the French Revolution happens, and they eventually behead the King and Queen, 1793, so it's 3 or 4 years that it happens, and now you have revolutionary France that's in control. And that's awesome, but we turned our back on revolutionary France. France fought for us, but we said, well, we fought for the, it was the king that we had to trade, the King Louis the 16th. King Louis XVI was the ones that had fought with us. You're the revolutionary government, so we don't have a treaty with you. You're a different person, and you killed the guy that we had a treaty with. So even though France and the peasants and the people and all the tax and all the resources, Louisville is named after King Louis, St. Louis is named after the Louisiana Purchase, Louisiana is all named after King Louis XVI, and exchange, because the French had all the, the dominion of it, but also because Louisville was named after him, specifically, to honor him, because he helped the Americans fight the Revolution, not for our benefit, but to, fuck over England. And so even though France fought with America against England, as soon as Washington becomes president, he'd been British during the French and Indian War, for 20 years or so, or his whole life. He was British his whole life and just became American. But as soon as he becomes an American, he wants to become the most favored trading nation of England, signs this treaty to trade with England, essentially taking sides between this war between France and England. We're going to trade with one country but not the other country. And Thomas Jefferson is going to resign over this because he says, isn't that the same thing what France is fighting for, the revolution, for the people to be free? Isn't that the same thing we're fighting for? But that's not how Alexander Hamilton and George Washington saw it. So they went ahead and sided with the English, and then War of 1812, the English come back, they fight us, they burn down our White House and the President's house and the Library of Congress, and, they sack Washington, D.C. That's probably the greatest foreign policy disaster in American history. Getting our White House, our Capitol, burnt down to the ground. And a lot of it had to do with the Jay Treaty because we sided with England over revolutionary France. Now, if we picked France to be our most favored trading nation with, we would have already looked at the English as hostile, and we wouldn't have had to fight them again. But the War of 1812 was also about taking over Canada and killing Indians. So, Che Guevara, he hung deserters. He goes to the United Nations and says, I've had to hang deserters during the Cuban Revolution. There was people that deserted, I had to hang them. George Washington did the same thing. So that's an interesting perspective. He's on the dollar bill. George Washington is on the dollar bill, and it's, the global monetary currency that would pass all throughout the entire world. This is incredible. What do you think Africa feels? What do you think Haiti feels? What do you think anybody feels when they look at even black people? I don't even know how. I know some black people that says that they didn't like George Washington because he owned slaves. Anybody who's educated and pays attention, and you see the dollar bill and you see the face of a slave owning, anti-revolutionary, veteran, land and pension stealing, slave puppy genociding, Native American genociding, slave teeth stealing piece of shit. When they look at his face, you think that's a good thing? When it comes to marketing, even if you take the same product and repackage it, then it becomes, it's exciting and it's something new. That's good for our dollar. That's good for our monetary policy. But instead, we're going to keep this asshole's face on it. And around the world, if you're an educated person in Africa, I don't see how you could look at the face of a slave owner and respect that person. So that's a bad face. That's a bad. Martin Luther King would kick George Washington's ass for the face of our $1 bill. Jill Stein would be a better face. She's gorgeous, very lovable. She would be a better person for the $1 bill. So, that's it's just insane. It's just fucking crazy. He hung deserters. So he would conscript them. You're going to fight. Oh, you're not going to fight. You ran away. Now you're killed. Now you're dead. And, it's war. So, even then, Julie Chancellor defending that too. Any bad thing that I could have mentioned about George, no. And 318 slaves. He's in a loveless relationship with Martha Washington. And he's, the president. Who's going to question the president on anything he does? He's back in the woods, where nobody can see. Nobody knows what's going on. You think he might have raped some of them slaves? Old, frumpy, ugly Martha Washington. You think he was doing anything with her? He had no kids with her. It was a business relationship to increase his social status. She's ugly. He controls 318 people. I think he might have dipped his quill in the company ink. I think he might have actually, ate where he shat. That's a stupid phrase anyways. But I think it's possible to think that he could have been a rapist. And so he hung deserters. Now, number 8, George Washington used $400,000 of American taxes and 1,000 guns for the suppression of the slave rebellion in Haiti. This is when he's president. I should have put a year on this, but there's a rebellion, again, he was against revolutionary France, and then there's a slave rebellion in Haiti, and that made him think about his own slaves. And so he sides one more time, One more time he goes against and then eventually Haiti becomes free. But he spent American taxes and gave them guns in order to suppress the slave rebellion in Haiti. He didn't give a shit about freedom. He didn't give a shit about revolution. And then, the probable raping of his slaves. So the alarm is going off right now. It's going to be a little bit annoying. So that's 9 reasons why George Washington was a piece of shit.